Hi kids, my name is Dr. Jeff Day and I'm with the Texas Tech University Chess Program. And the purpose of this video is to introduce you to two different topics. The first, something called tactics. Tactics are tools that players use against each other in order to gain advantages. Secondly, to introduce you to something called pawn structures, or sometimes also called pawn skeletons. Pawn structures, skeletons, oftentimes will dictate the type of game that we are going to play and the type of endgame that we're going to face. Both of these topics are important for you to learn. A, they will help you become a better chess player. And B, they will help you do better on the UIL chess exam, because many of the more advanced questions on the exam deal with tactics and pawn structure. So without further ado, let's go ahead and move over to a live chessboard so I can walk you through some of these. In order to do that, I need to share my screen with you. So one moment, please. Hi, and welcome to my screen. So the first tactic that I'd like to introduce to you is something called a skewer. It's a rather silly word, but a skewer can be a very powerful tool. In this particular position, it's white's turn to move. Okay? If you already think you know what a skewer is, pause the video, take a look at the position, and see if you can tell me what move would white make in order to create a skewer. Okay? Assuming you've unpaused your computer, let's go ahead and show you the move. White, bishop to b5. All right, what's so significant about that move? A piece of greater value sits in front of a piece of lower value. You'll notice that the queen, does not have a square to move to in order to defend the knight. The queen can't, as an example, come here. The white queen would take it. The black queen cannot go, or could go, to the square right here, but white would capture, black would capture, and white would capture. So in this particular case, a skewer is when a piece of greater value sits in front of a piece of lower value. We attempt to chase away the piece of greater value in order to nab the piece behind it. A skewer, one more time, is when a piece of greater value sits in front of a piece of lower value. By chasing the piece in front away, we're able to gain material. Okay, that's called a skewer. Now, something that's very similar to a skewer, I'm going to clear the board and set up a new position for you. Something called a pin. Let's take a look at a position that actually occurs a fair amount of time in chess games between players of all skill levels. Okay, I've brought us to this particular position because it shows us two different kinds of pins. One is called an absolute pin, the other is called a relative pin. What's an absolute pin? The absolute pin in this particular position is the bishop pinning the knight. This knight is prohibited from moving because doing so would expose the king behind it to check. It is illegal in chess to make a move that places our king in check. Therefore, this knight is stuck here. It can't move. It is pinned, and it is an absolute pin. Now, there's a second pin on the board. If you spotted it, it's right here. But in this particular case, it's not an absolute pin, it's a relative pin. Well, why is that? Let's say that white decides to move this. First of all, that is a legal move. White is not prohibited from moving the knight. Now, whether or not it's a good move for white, that's for players to decide. Many of you will see that the bishop can now take the queen. When white recaptures, black has captured a queen, white only has a bishop. It's a rather big gain of material for black. Let's go ahead and backward for a moment. So to reiterate, a pin is when a piece of lesser value is in front of a piece of greater value. It's the exact opposite of skewer, if you'll recall. Again, it's when a piece of lesser value, this knight, is in front of a piece of greater value, the queen. The absolute pin is when the pinned piece cannot move, when it violates the rules of chess. A relative pin is when the piece could move, and then it's up to the player to decide whether it's worth it or not. Okay, let's go ahead and reset the board. We've talked about skewers, and we've talked about pins. Let's talk about forks. Forks appear a great deal in our games, and I'll go ahead and set up a position for you right now. If white is not paying attention, let's say that white does this, getting ready to fianchetto the bishop and castle. Black now has a move where it can attack two pieces of greater value with one move. Those of you who have been playing chess for a while, you probably see what the move is. Those of you that might be a little bit newer, go ahead and pause the video for a second and see if you can guess what Black's next move would be. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully all of you selected knight takes c2. Okay, what is the significance of knight takes c2? Well, first of all, it attacks the king, right? So we've put the king in check. But more importantly, or at least of equal importance, we've also attacked the rook. Now we know that the knight is worth 3 points. The rook is worth 5 points. If we can capture the rook with our knight, we have gained material. We've given up 3 points in order to get 5 points. That's a pretty good trade for us. The reason we call it a fork is because both pieces are actually being attacked at the same time by the knight. The knight can attack the king, and the knight is also attacking the rook. When the black king moves out of check, the black knight takes the rook and is now up material. That's a fork, a piece of lesser value attacking two pieces of greater value. There are many different varieties of forks. Let me go ahead and show you another one. I'm going to clear the board on this particular one because I think it'll just be easier for you. I'll go ahead and put a king just so you can kind of get the direction of where the pawns are headed. So the black pawn, of course, is headed from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. And in this particular case, these rooks are said to be forked because on its next move, black could capture this rook or this rook. Obviously, a pawn is worth 1 point, and these rooks are worth 5 points. If one rook moves away, the pawn simply takes the other rook. Let me go ahead and show you that position again. White can only get one of the rooks moved away, which then allows the black pawn to take the other one. Now, there are some cases, depending on the position, where the first piece that is attacked in a fork can safely move away and maybe deliver a check, which then buys time for the second piece to move away safely. But in the truest definition of the word, the position on the board right now is a fork. One piece of lesser value is attacking two pieces of greater value. Okay? Let's go ahead now. We'll reset the board, and we will only look at legal moves now, and we'll say it's white's turn to move. So far, we've covered skewers, pins, and forks. What I'd like to cover now is something called a target square. A target square, many of you probably use it all the time and you just didn't really know what it was called. Let me show you a position that probably occurs in a whole lot of your games, especially if you're still somewhat of a new player. Okay, now on white's next move, we already know that white can deliver checkmate. But before white's move, I want to draw attention to this particular square. This square is being attacked by the bishop, but this square is also being attacked by the queen. Therefore, this square is what we would call a target square. We are bringing more than one piece to bear to attack a square. A target square can be anywhere on a chessboard. Advanced players would know that this particular square is unusually weak on a chessboard. And the players who are a little more advanced will know why that is. Of course, it's because this square is only being defended by the king. All of these other squares are being defended by pieces of lesser value. But the moment we draw our king so early in the game to defending a pawn or a square, oftentimes players will attempt to launch an attack against that square. Okay. Sometimes you'll then see black attempt to block the checkmate, and now white has set something like this. Now, as for whether this is a good move or not, I don't want to get too deeply into that, but I do now want to talk about what this is called. Two pieces are attacking a target square along the same line, right? The queen and the bishop both are moving diagonally to attack this target square. Yeah, we'll put legal moves back on. So that square right there is considered to be the target square, and these two pieces are forming a battery, and the term we use is battery, to attack the target square. Another example of a battery, I'll clear the board because I think it will just be easier for you. Sometimes you can have a battery made up of two rooks, right? In this particular position, these two rooks are attacking any of these squares because rooks move, as we know, rooks move along open files and rings. A battery, one of the benefits of a battery, of course, is that it brings two powerful pieces onto the same target square. Therefore, it forces the opponent to have to bring additional defense to the target square. What do we want to do to target squares? We want to bring as much pressure to bear as we can. So we may, let's go ahead and put this rook here. Let's go here. Now, in this particular position, we have three pieces attacking this target square: the bishop, the rook, and the rook. We also may be able to bring a knight on to this target square. Now the knight, the bishop, and both rooks are attacking this target square. Well, what else could we put to bring additional pressure onto that square? Well, maybe we set up another battery. So this is a battery, two pieces moving along the same line of attack, hitting a target square. But this is also a battery, two pieces attacking along the same line to hit a target square. All five of black's pieces, all five of white's pieces are hitting one single square. This would then, of course, force black to have five defenders because white has five attackers. Batteries are very powerful, and advanced players will attempt to find ways to exert pressure on target squares through batteries. And upon identifying the target square, bringing as much force as possible until the defender simply can't cope with the amount of pieces that we've brought. So we've covered forks, pins, skewers, and batteries. The next thing I want to show you is a deflection. Let me go ahead and reset the board for you. We'll put legal moves only, and we'll reset the board back up. So in this particular position, e4, e5, knight to f6. Knight to f6 attacks this e-pawn. It's not uncommon now to see black attempt to defend by playing knight to c6. It's certainly not unheard of to see white play bishop to b5. Now, what I want to point out to you is that this move indirectly actually attacks this pawn. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to for a moment. Okay, welcome back. Hopefully you have seen why this bishop move actually attacks this pawn. Those of you who see it realize it's because if white captures, we'll go ahead and make a move for black first. If white captures this knight and black now recaptures, technically this pawn is undefended. We have removed the defender with our bishop. Let's go back for a moment so you can see it again. What we have done is we have removed the piece that is defending our target, therefore freeing it for us to possibly try to capture. Now, in this particular case, it can be debated whether or not it makes sense for white to capture the pawn. And that's not really the purpose of this video lesson. The important thing here is to point out that we can attack pieces oftentimes by attacking the piece that defends it. If we can remove the defender, we can then more freely capture the piece of our choice. So, forks, pins, skewers, batteries, target squares, and deflection. Okay, that's going to cover our talk on tactics. There certainly is much more that chess players can learn regarding tactics. Chess.com has a wonderful video library that will walk you through many grandmaster games that will highlight how tactics surface routinely in games and how smart players are able to capitalize on them to gain one of three things: time, space, or material. Okay, very briefly, let's talk about pawn structure and pawn skeletons. To do this, I'm going to go ahead and clear the board. I'm going to put these three pawns together. Here we go. I'm then going to put a pawn here, and I'm going to put these two pawns here. For black, I'm going to put three pawns. I'm going to put this pawn here and a pawn here. Okay. And there we go. We'll actually take this one off so that it's 6 pawns to 6 pawns. There's a lot to learn from just the placement of these pawns. And in fact, there are some terms that you may want to learn about. Some of you who are a little more expert than advanced may already know that there are different kinds of pawns on this board that we can talk about. These three pawns together are considered to be a chain. They can move up the board together and they can defend each other. You'll see what I'm doing here. They all can kind of move together and slowly but surely defend each other as they move up the board. Pawns that are together like that, this is considered to be a pawn island, and it happens to have 3 of them. This pawn we'll get to in just one brief moment, but you'll notice that black also has the same thing. 3 pawns that can move together safely, defending each other as they move up the board. That is generally an ideal situation, to have pawns linked together so they can help defend each other as they move through the board. Black and white have something called doubled pawns. I've highlighted both pairs for you. Here's black's, here's white's. Doubled pawns pose interesting challenges in that the back pawn can't really defend the front pawn. They can move up the board together, certainly. Let's go ahead and put this pawn back, and I'll show you an example of what I'm referring to. So this pawn could move, and then this pawn could move, this pawn could move. They can move up the board together, but they don't actually defend each other. These are considered to be doubled pawns, and in the strictest sense, they are also considered to be isolated pawns. They're isolated because there's no pawn here, and there's no pawn here on the other side. In comparison, this center pawn, this pawn here, is not isolated. There's a pawn to its left and a pawn to its right. Even if this pawn were gone, let me take it off the board. These 2 pawns are still an island, and neither of them are considered to be isolated. They can make their way up the board, protecting each other and working together. This double pawn cannot move up the board together, defending each other. There may be some situations where isolated pawns, because of the squares that they influence, can pose a problem. The problem that the person with the double pawn experiences, however, is that the double pawns, of course, cannot protect each other. What is the nature of this pawn here in the center? I've purposely saved it for last. This is considered to be an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn generally will be a very ripe target. If your opponent has an isolated pawn, you may want to make it a target square and try and set up a battery to go after that square. The problem with isolated pawns, of course, is that they don't have pawns on either side to defend them. These 2 pawns can work together and help each other. But this pawn in the center doesn't have anyone to help it. Isolated pawns, as I said before, make for a great target. There's something else that's very unique about this pawn. It's also considered to be a passed pawn. What is a passed pawn? A passed pawn is when a pawn has passed all of the other pawns and now has a free path to promotion. Now, yes, black can attempt to block these three squares with pieces, but black has no pawns to stop the white pawn, and therefore we would consider this pawn to be passed. These three pawns are blocked by these two pawns. Even though it's 3-on-2, these two, at least initially, can serve to block these three. None of these three pawns here are passed. These three pawns can all be blocked, at least at the moment, by these two pawns. None of these three pawns are considered to be passed. The only passed pawn on the board is this one right here. So, to make sure that I haven't lost you with some of the terms that we're using, a pawn island is a collection or group of pawns. Here's a great example. Doubled pawns are when pawns are stacked on top of each other. In this particular case, doubled pawns. In this particular case, doubled pawns. Okay, let's go ahead and put this passed pawn back here. Okay. Isolated pawn. There is no pawn to the left or right to help usher it down the board. These three pawns can all work together. These two pawns can all work together. None of the five that I'm currently showing you would be considered to be isolated. When you have a 3-on-2, one of them may eventually become isolated. When you have a 3-on-2, one of them may become isolated, and maybe even passed. This pawn is isolated and passed. Because it is isolated, it makes for a great target. Because it is passed, it poses a very big threat to eventually become promoted. And the reason for that, of course, is there are no pawns to stop it. Let me just give you a quick example. Now, if white wants to try and move this pawn down the board, black just takes it. So a passed pawn derives its power to some degree in that it cannot be challenged by opposing pawns. It forces the opponent to use pieces to stop it or to try to capture it. So when we talk about pawn skeleton and pawn islands, I'm going to clear the board for a second, and I'm now going to set this up. And over here, I'm going to set something for black. White has what we would call two pawn islands. Hopefully you can see that. I'll go ahead and highlight for you. All of these pawns are linked together. They all can work together to move down the board. They are one island. White also, unfortunately, has this pawn over here. It is also considered an island, and it's by itself. If you recall, in the terms that we just used, we would call this an isolated pawn. It would be an ideal target for black to go after. Let's compare that now with black. Black has one island, two islands, three islands, four islands. Black is going to have a much more difficult time because it has 5 islands and white only has 2. Hopefully what's making sense to you here is that these 6 pawns can work together to make their way down the board. They can defend each other, they can attack, they can take up space. Black's position is much more difficult. These islands are going to force black to use pieces to defend them. The isolated pawn here will become a target. The isolated pawn here will become a target. There's something else in chess that we call backward pawns. In this particular case, this is a backward pawn. It's behind another pawn. What that means is there's no pawn behind it that can defend it. There's no pawn to either side of it that it can move forward. Backward pawns also make ideal targets, much in the same way that isolated pawns do. Doubled pawns obviously always produce, backward pawns. So if we're clear, let's talk about the different kinds of pawns that we've talked about. We have isolated pawns, pawns that are by themselves. We have doubled pawns, pawns that are stacked on top of each other. Let's go ahead and just briefly, I will remove these three pieces of those pawns. Passed pawn. Passed pawn has no pawns in front of it that can block it. This pawn also happens to be isolated. Okay, so we have isolated, we have doubled, we have backwards right here, we have passed right here, we have isolated right here. And as we talked about before, we also have a pawn island. This one happens to be 3. And those 3 pawns ideally will work their way up the board, supporting each other, claiming space, and potentially even launching attacks against pieces that get in its way. Okay, I don't want to overload you. There's a fair amount of content in this particular video. Tactics. Tactics are extremely important, and every good player will utilize tactics as often as they can in order to gain time, space, and material. Some of the tactics that we covered in this video: skewers, pins, forks, batteries, target squares, deflection. We also talked about the value of having pawns that can work together. Pawns that are together in a chain are considered to be an island. The fewer islands we have, generally speaking, the better off we are. And that's because islands can help defend and protect each other. The more islands we have, chances are, the more doubled pawns we have or isolated pawns we have. If we have doubled pawns, we certainly are going to have backward pawns. Backward pawns and isolated pawns make for excellent targets. Passed pawns, the final kind of pawn, a passed pawn is a very big threat. And an opposing player will generally attempt to stop your passed pawn any way they can, because a passed pawn will eventually move towards promotion, which means it might become a queen or a rook, whatever your position needs. Okay, thank you so much for your time and attention on this video. I'll stop the share for a moment. Let me thank you for watching. I hope that this was informative. If you are able to bring tactics into your play, if you are able to understand and use knowledge about pawns and pawn structure, you'll become a better player and you'll do better on the UIL exam. Finally, I'd also recommend to you that chess.com has some amazing tools, 3 different memberships, one of them which is entirely free, and it allows you to play a wide variety of chess against a wide variety of opponents, which will help you become a better player. So, thank you for your time, and best of luck to you on the exam.